Bright Minds, the podcast from the John Adams Institute, is brought to you by the members of the John Adams. Why not become a member yourself, or even better, a patron, and enjoy all the extras and benefits? Find out more at john-adams.nl, john-adams.nl, and click on Become a Member. From Amsterdam, this is Bright Minds, the podcast from the John Adams Institute, a treasure trove of the best and the brightest of American thinking. And this episode's great thinker, Carol Anderson, says that the whole idea of one person, one vote depends on where you live, the color of your skin, and if you've got the right kind of ID.
In Texas, they said you must have a government-issued photo ID to be able to vote. But your student ID from a state college or university does not count. Your concealed weapon card does. This is how you're able to carve out your electorate, by carving out the types of IDs that give people access to the ballot box.
Carol Anderson says that racism so undermines the right to vote that it is undermining American democracy itself. Anderson is a professor of African American Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and she spoke to our John Adams audience in May of 2022 to talk about her two most recent books. The second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America, and One Person, No Vote. Ms. Anderson also contends the Second Amendment is not about guns, but about anti-Blackness. At first, she spoke about how the right to vote is under assault, and then she was joined on stage for an interview by the Ugandan-born Dutch presenter Andrew Makinga for discussion about how support for the Second Amendment is related to race. So, from Amsterdam, here's Professor Carol Anderson.
Wow. But we're going to talk about America. And we're not going to talk about America in terms of that wonderful myth history that gets laid down. We're going to talk about America. And so I'm going to start off with talking about a Black veteran. His name was Maceo Snipes. He fought in World War II. He fought in the Pacific. And he came home in 1946, and he was going to vote. And he was going to vote because that was a key election. There was a man running for governor, a man named Eugene Talmadge, who was a white supremacist of the first magnitude. He ran on a platform of, you keep them right where they belong. Well, Maceo was like, I fought fascist. What you got? Because Maceo has swag. And Maceo went to go vote. And there was a sign over the door that read something to the effect of, the first Negro that votes, that'll be the last thing he ever does. Maceo was like, I fought fascist. I fought for democracy, and I'm going to get some of that right here in Georgia in 1946. And so Maceo went into that voting booth, and he cast his ballot. And it was not for Eugene Talmadge, I'm sure. He came out. Nothing. He went, ooh, cool. He goes home, nothing. Yeah. Few days later, knock on his door. Maceo comes to the door and there's a white man there. And he says, would you step out? And Maceo's like, sure. And he goes and he steps out on his front porch, and then three other white men show up and he hears, chick, chick. It was a firing squad. And they laid Maceo out. It took him several days to die. But the message was clear. You vote, you die. You vote, you die. You vote, you die. And remember, this is 1946, after the Nazis had been defeated. This is the kind of physical violence that we think about when we think about Jim Crow, when we think about disfranchisement. But I want to bring us back to another kind of violence, the violence that I call bureaucratic violence. Because it is that bureaucratic violence that does enormous damage. And that bureaucratic violence then sanctions the physical violence that laid Maceo Snipes out. That bureaucratic violence, I'm going to take us back to 1890. Yeah, because I'm a historian, so we're going to go back in time a bit. 1890 to Mississippi. And I know you might be surprised that I'm going to start in Mississippi, but don't be. In Mississippi, what had happened was that African-American men, because in that time only men could vote, African-American men were aligning with poor whites and voting in governments that were about how do we dismantle this capitalist system that is oppressing us? How do we put in place policies and politicians who believe that when you work, you should be able to have a living wage? How do we do that? And so as they were joining together, the powers that be looked at that alliance and said, oh, we got to stop this. We cannot have this. And so they started hollering, voter fraud, voter fraud, voter fraud. We need to have election integrity. We need to clean up the ballot box. We need to ensure that our democracy is strong and free of all of this fraud. That's all we're going to do. And so Mississippi rewrote its constitution. It's called the Mississippi Plan. And the Mississippi Plan was, how do we stop Black folks from voting without saying we don't want Black folks to vote? Because there was this thing called the 15th Amendment in the Constitution that came after the American Civil War. And in that amendment, it says, the right to vote shall not be abridged on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So that's what prevented Mississippi from writing a law saying, we don't want Black folks to vote. But Mississippi said, oh, but we got this. What we're going to do is we're going to use the legacies of slavery and make those legacies the access to the ballot box. And we're going to make it all look legitimate. So, how do you do that? So you say, oh, democracy is expensive. You know, holding these elections are so expensive. You've got to have all of these ballots. You've got to have people who are taking the ballots. You've got to have people who are counting the ballots. So if you really believed in democracy, you would be willing to pay a small fee, a poll tax, in order to be able to vote. Now, it sounds legitimate on its surface, except that small fee, because of centuries of unpaid labor, followed by the Black codes, which tried to reinstill slavery by another name after the Civil War, followed then by sharecropping, meant that that small fee amounted to 2 to 6% of a Mississippi farm family's annual income. And that poll tax was due every year. Imagine paying 2 to 6% of your annual income to vote, the poll tax. But the Mississippi Plan was like, you know, but there are some Black folks who have a little bit of money. And so they're going to look at that poll tax and go, what? So we're going to add another hurdle. Another hurdle was the literacy test. And again, it's going to sound legitimate, like a protection of democracy. And saying, you know, we really want to make sure that the folks who are voting understand our laws, our value systems, understand what we are, who we are. So we don't think it's too much to ask that they read a section of the Constitution. Now, that might sound like, well, yeah, you want an informed electorate. The problem is, during slavery, the enslaved were banned from learning, banned from being educated, banned from literacy. If they slipped up and showed that they were illiterate, they could be killed or they would be tortured, sending the message to the rest of the Black community, don't you learn anything? And then after the Civil War, you had severely unfunded Black schools. So when you have the state ensuring that you do not have a quality education and then the state requiring that you have a quality education to be able to vote, that's how you can say we don't want black folks to vote without saying we don't want black folks to vote. And there were other elements in this Mississippi plan. I'm not going to go through all of them because we only got 25 minutes and I could be here for 49 hours with these things. But what it said was, if you get through this one, there's another hurdle. If you get through this hurdle, there's another hurdle. If you get through this hurdle, there's another one. And then there's another one. It's making the right to vote a privilege. That all of these barriers that you have to achieve and accomplish in order to be able to vote. The Mississippi Plan was so effective that it started in 1890, and there were 190,000 black men registered to vote. By 1892, 2 years later, there were 8,600. And the U.S. Supreme Court in 1898 blessed the poll tax and the literacy test in the Williams decision, saying it does not violate the 15th Amendment because everybody has to pay and everybody has to read. Now, that literacy test was so wicked, and I do mean wicked, in that this thing is still in living memory. Mr. L, who is a man who was part of my village, who helped raise me in Columbus, Ohio. He lived in Georgia, and he told me that his literacy test question when he went to register to vote, because they didn't want him reading the Constitution, it was, how high is up? The registrar had such arbitrary power over who could vote. In Mississippi, one of the questions was, how many bubbles in a bar of soap? So when the state can ask you an unanswerable question and make that unanswerable question the access to the ballot box, the power of the literacy test and of the poll tax and of the other measures was that by 1940, when the Second World War is raging, only 3% of black folks in the South were registered to vote. And in the United States of America, in the South is where black folks lived. The vast majority of black folks lived in the South. Only 3% were registered. This is part of why you see this massive, massive civil rights movement. This movement to make democracy real. This movement to break the back of Jim Crow. This would lead to that cinematic explosion in 1965 on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, where you see John Lewis and Hosea Williams and 600 nonviolent protesters behind them, coming in a massive clash with the Alabama State Patrol and Sheriff Jim Clark's posse. It was horrific. The tear gas, the whips wrapped in barbed wire, the horses trampling over people. It was so horrific that ABC cut into its movie of the week. And those of us who are old enough to remember that ABC was one of the only 3 channels and that it had a movie of the week, they cut into their movie of the week, Judgment at Nuremberg, to show the footage from Bloody Sunday. The nation was shocked because they had heard that there was something going on, but they didn't think it was that. And so seeing it just shocked the nation. And it led to eventually the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. That Voting Rights Act was landmark legislation because what it did was it had what they called the pre-clearance provision. So a state that had a history of discrimination and used one of those Mississippi Plan devices had to get all of its voting laws and policies okayed first by the U.S. Department of Justice or by the federal court in Washington, D.C., before they could implement it. Prior to that time, they would implement one of these discriminatory laws, one right after the other. There would be lengthy court cases, lengthy litigation, and meanwhile, these elections are happening with this discriminatory process in place. This was to cut all of that mess out. And for the most part, it worked. Just to give you a sense, in Mississippi, where we began, in the early 1960s, only 6.7% of African Americans were registered to vote in Mississippi. And I'm here to tell you, Mississippi got some black folk. And when you've only got 6.7%, you can see the power of Jim Crow, the power of bureaucratic violence laced with the physical violence. After the Voting Rights Act of 1965, in 2 years, almost 60% of African Americans were registered to vote in Mississippi. This thing worked. It worked so well that it was doomed because it worked so well, because it really opened up democracy. It really gave a hint of what a truly multiracial democracy could look like, what multiracial power could look like. And so that's why you see in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court gutted the pre-clearance provision of the Voting Rights Act. And as they would say in hip hop or rap, who let the dogs out? Because, these states went hog wild. Within 2 hours after the Shelby County v. Holder decision, Texas implemented a racially discriminatory voter ID law. And so let me tell you about voter ID, because that's, again, one of those things like the poll tax that sounds logical and rational on its face, but is nasty, wicked behind. So what it says is we have all of this massive, rampant voter fraud. Voter fraud, voter fraud. And so we don't think it's too much to ask for you to show an ID to be able to vote. Well, what they don't tell you is, one, there's not all of this massive, rampant voter fraud. Justin Levitt, a law professor out of California, did a study. From 2000 to 2014, there were 1 billion votes cast in the United States. That's Carl Saganish. Billion votes cast. There were 31 cases of voter impersonation fraud out of 1 billion votes. That's the massive, rampant voter fraud. But if you say it enough, it conjures up a sense of reality. Then what they don't tell you is that not any ID will work. Your library card won't work. It is a government-issued photo ID. But then again, not all government-issued photo IDs. So in Texas, that immediately 2 hours after the Shelby County v. Holder decision, they said you must have a government-issued photo ID to be able to vote. But your student ID from a state college or university does not count. But your concealed weapon card does. This is how you're able to carve out your electorate, by carving out the types of IDs that give people access to the ballot box. In Alabama said you must have a government-issued photo ID to be able to vote. Then said, but your public housing ID does not count. It doesn't get more government issued than public housing. But 71% of those in public housing in Alabama are African American. And the NAACP Legal Defense Fund found out that for many, it was the only government-issued photo ID they had. But then there's the driver's license. Well, Governor Bentley, listening to his mistress, you can't make this stuff up. And I'm like, Lord, there's got to be some really interesting pillow talk. Baby, you know what I want? Ooh, what? I want you to shut down the Department of Motor Vehicles in the Black Belt counties. Okay. And that's what he did. He shut them down. But for fiscal reasons, he had to balance the budget. Well, what that meant then for those who lived in the Black Belt counties was that they were going to have to go 50 miles to get a driver's license. But I say to you, if you don't have a driver's license, how do you get there? Well, you think public transportation, except Alabama's ranked 48th in the nation in terms of public transportation. So this is how you create an obstacle based on a lie. Government-issued photo ID, and then you create an obstacle to the obstacle. Your public housing ID doesn't count, and you're going to have to go 100 miles round trip in order to get a driver's license to vote. Voter ID. One of the other methods that they used was early voting. And it was to constrict early voting. Early voting was put in place because in the U.S., the major election day is that Tuesday in November. Most working folk cannot get off that Tuesday in November. And in Atlanta, where I live, Emory University is here. It's one of the state's largest employers. A sizable Black community is here. Atlanta's traffic. Whoo, you're calling God's name. To get from here to there by 8 o'clock in the morning when you have to punch in the clock, in the words of that Nobel poet laureate Aretha Franklin, ain't no way. And so being able to have early voting where you have more days, they open up weeks for you to be able to vote before Election Day. This really provides access to the ballot box. Well, what these folks did was to shut down early voting in really clever ways. Ohio said, okay, every county, it's going to sound equitable, every county is going to get one early voting site. Well, Cuyahoga County, where the city of Cleveland is, has over 1 million people. Pickaway County, with that thriving metropolis Circleville, has 60,000. When you have one for each county, it means that there are counties where folks can get in and out quickly, and others where folks are in line. There were 6,000 people in line in Franklin County, where Columbus, Ohio is. 6,000 people in line waiting to vote. Or you could be Indiana. What Indiana did was to say, because in 2008, Indiana went for Obama. And that was like heart clutch time, like Fred Sanford with Elizabeth. I don't know if anybody's ever seen Sanford and Son, but it was like, Lizbeth, woo! And so they went to figure out, how did this happen? How did Obama win Indiana? Well, it turned out Black folks came out in droves using early voting in Indianapolis. And that's what flipped the state. So the legislature passed a law saying counties that have more than 325,000 residents could only have one early voting site. Counties that had fewer could have more. Yeah. There are only 3 counties in Indiana that have more than 325,000 residents. That's the county where Gary, Indiana is, where Fort Wayne, Indiana is, and where Indianapolis is. That accounts for almost 70% of the state's Black population. This is how you do it. This is how you say we don't want Black folks to vote. Without putting it into the law, we don't want Black folks to vote. The same thing happens with gerrymandering, voter roll purges, and felony disfranchisement. And I'm going to go quickly through felony disfranchisement. And then Andrew and I are getting ready to have a conversation. With felony disfranchisement, what it says is that if you have a felony conviction, you have lost your voting rights. Now, there were 4 states in the United States where it was permanent. You permanently lost your voting rights. One of those states was Florida. In the U.S. in 2018, there were 6.1 million Americans who could not vote because of a felony conviction. 1.7 million of them were in Florida. 40% of Black men in Florida could not vote because of a felony conviction. Over 20% of all African American adults could not vote in Florida because of a felony conviction. Florida launched its felony conviction law in 1868 during Reconstruction, after Congress had passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867 that said that Black men could vote. Florida then wrote its felony disfranchisement law and then crafted laws that were only applicable to Black people or only applied to Black folks. This is how you get that massive racial disparity. Well, in 2018, the communities got together and there was a ballot initiative, Amendment 4, and it was to restore the voting rights to 1.2 million of that 1.5 million. It passed by 65%. Yeah. Well, legislature looked up, and again, it was a heart clutch, Fred Sanford Elizabeth moment. Because if you're thinking about 40% of Black men and over 20% of the Black population being able to get their voting rights back, and they said, we know we're going to need clarifying language for what does it mean when you have completed your sentence. And to complete your sentence, it means that you have not only served your time, done your parole, but you have paid all fines, fees, and court restitution. Well, activists looked up and said, Lord, that sounds like a poll tax, because you don't have to pay your income tax to be able to vote. And you don't have to pay your property tax to be able to vote. But here you have to pay fines, fees, and restitution. So this thing goes up to the court. The court ruled that, no, this isn't a poll tax, but the court went one worse than that. The court said, not only is this not a poll tax, but Florida doesn't have to tell you how much you owe. So it is the worst of the poll tax and the literacy test. How high is up? One of the things that you see in the United States is this massive push with grassroots activists and people demanding democracy. And you see this power structure that is cleverly working its way around the constitutional language and the legal language in order to figure out how to deny the right to vote. What we have to understand is that voting is not an obstacle course. Voting is not a privilege. It is a right. Thank you.
And with that, the Ugandan-born Dutch presenter Andrew McKinga joined Carol Anderson to talk about how America will never get guns under control as long as there is an irrational fear of Black people.
Carol, in Dutch there's a word for a fun conversation. They call it gezellig. This is not gezellig. The 25th was the 3rd anniversary of George Floyd's killing on camera. We were all protesting in the Netherlands, white, black, yellow, all colors. Yeah. But we also witnessed an execution of people in Buffalo. And I didn't see a praying for Buffalo on Facebook. And not to blame Facebook, but what is going on when police can be in front of a school where somebody is killing children, shooting them in the face, the parents can't bury. If the parents would choose to open the casket, it would look like Emmett Till. Mm-hmm. Sorry to bring you through this, but your book is filled with lynchings, made me cry at moments. What is wrong with America when Breonna Taylor can be killed in her house while police can be inside a school, outside a school, and inside the school somebody's killing children?
That is a fabulous question. I'm going to try to answer it for you. One of the things that I laid out in the second was the power of anti-Blackness. and how it has warped the United States of America, how it has made full citizenship for Black people just this ephemeral thing that you almost get close to and then it evaporates. How it treats Black people as a threat to the nation. So when you have someone like Trayvon Martin, who was a 17-year-old child who was just coming from a convenience store with Skittles and iced tea, and he is stalked through his neighborhood by a grown man with a loaded gun. And the jury rules that it was self-defense, that it was justifiable homicide for a grown man to shoot down an unarmed child because that child was threatening. Breonna Taylor was threatening. Katherine Johnston, who was a 92-year-old woman in Atlanta, the cops burst through her door. It's 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. She's afraid. She has a rusty revolver because she doesn't know who's coming through her door. She shoots once, and they pummeled her with bullets. And they said, "We were afraid."
Tamir Rice.
Tamir Rice, within 2 seconds, "We were afraid. He was dangerous." Amir Locke, who just happened this year, where they burst through his apartment. He was asleep on the couch. He had a gun beside him. They saw the gun. Within 10 seconds, he shot dead. We were afraid. The fear of Blackness, the fear of Black people, is what prevents the United States of America from implementing real gun safety legislation.
Are Americans aware of that fear? That fear of Black people, the inherent criminality of Blacks?
It comes through in these kinds of Southern strategy ways. So after the shooting at Uvalde, you have the politicians like Greg Abbott, who is the governor of Texas, and John Cornyn, I believe, who is a U.S. senator from Texas, talking about, yeah, there's Uvalde, but what about Chicago? And Chicago becomes that kind of what they call dog whistle. It is a way to say it without saying it, but you hear it. And you know exactly what it means. What about all those Black folk killing all of those Black people? Because you know Black people are dangerous. And so that is what I call that narrative of Black pathology. Yes, over 80% of Black folks kill Black folk, are killed by Black folk. Over 80% of white people are killed by white people. But
That's news.
But do you ever hear about white-on-white crime? That's a term that's like, Arr? I mean, it's like a Scooby-Doo moment, isn't it? We're talking about Shaggy.
And you know why this is so important? Because I found out as a Black man living in Europe, consuming American media, I look at America through the lens of CNN. So I'll be afraid to go to my own people because Chicago's, you'll die. It's Iraq.
Right.
It's Afghanistan.
Yeah.
You can't do that. I saw it on CNN. And you told me Chicago doesn't even have the highest.
It's not the highest. Neither is New York. Mm-hmm.
You said about the book, it isn't a pro-gun or an anti-gun book. Mm-hmm. This is a book about Black people's rights and seeing those rights consistently undermined because of anti-Blackness coursing through the nation that sees Black people as a threat, and so it doesn't matter whether we're armed or unarmed.
Yes.
Do we need to rethink what real safety and security looks like in the United States?
We absolutely do. And we have almost 400 million guns in the United States. We have more guns than we have people. And we are not safe. We are not secure. Our children are afraid to go to school. But one of the things that I have argued when I said anti-Blackness stops us from having this real conversation. When the Second Amendment was right before it was being formulated, when the U.S. Constitution was being ratified, the plantation owners, Patrick Henry and George Mason in the state of Virginia, were arguing to scuttle the Constitution because the militia was being placed under federal control and you couldn't trust the feds. If we have a slave uprising, because you know we're going to, we can't trust those folks from Pennsylvania and Massachusetts to send the militia down to help us. We will be left defenseless. That language of we will be left defenseless. I then go to Jonathan Metzl, who wrote a book, Dying of Whiteness. And one of the pieces, and he is a psychiatrist and a sociologist out of Vanderbilt University in Tennessee. And he did this study, and he was in rural Missouri, and he was dealing with white families who had had gun violence happen in their families. And so they're in a support group, and he's talking with them. And so he brings up gun safety legislation. And they went, oh, absolutely not. I've got to have my gun because those people from St. Louis will come down here and try to take everything we have if we don't have our guns. We will be left defenseless.
That really pissed me off reading your books. Not only, and you have to read the book, the second also, all these amendments and how they were negotiated just based on that fear that you described of blackness. How these criminals were scared of what happened in Haiti and were like, oh no. How they even stopped armed black men in fighting for America because they were scared they would kick off a revolution.
Yes.
It brings me to the point where I read about the Deacons for Defense and Justice.
Yes.
And I want to ask you, Professor, this whole sanitized image of Dr. King, it's like Nelson Mandela, it's like, they were not all dancing and marching. These guys had guns, and they weren't effed with because the Klan was taking care of people. Could you tell me something about maybe the other side of this? Because when I say, should we rethink, what should you do if you know your kids can be killed in school? Should you arm yourself? Should you be like the Deacons for Defense?
So the Deacons for Defense were a group coming out of Bogalusa, Louisiana in the 1960s, early 1960s. And they became basically the armed defense wing of the civil rights workers who were trying to get black folks registered to vote in Louisiana. Because the Klan was terrorizing civil rights workers, and because the Klan was linked in really closely with the sheriff's office and with the police station, there was no law enforcement support for those folks trying to get folks registered to vote and trying to prevent them from being killed and tortured and terrorized by the Klan. So the Deacons for Defense came into being. And you knew that the Deacons did not play. They did not play. And the Klan backed down. It's part of the story that doesn't always get told about the nonviolent civil rights movement. There was nothing nonviolent about the civil rights movement. There was violence everywhere. And some of that violence was designed to protect the civil rights workers.
We should tell that story as well.
Yes. The question about should we be armed, one of the things that has happened since the pandemic is that African Americans have been buying more guns.
Whoa.
I've got to tell you, given how blackness is already the default threat in America, blackness with a gun is an exponential threat. I don't know if you heard about the case of Ahmaud Arbery. Yes, he was the black man who was jogging in Georgia. And basically, these guys following the slave catcher code thought that they had the right to stop him, and they gunned him down. I remember the district attorney's closing arguments, and she kept emphasizing that Ahmaud Arbery had nothing on him but his jogging shorts and his shoes. And that's what made him innocent. Imagine if Ahmaud Arbery had had even a pocket knife on him.
So that's not going to be the solution.
Yeah. Black folks don't have innocence. We don't have the benefit of the doubt. It is the thing that allows Kyle Rittenhouse, who was the white teenager who went over into Kenosha, Wisconsin, with an illegally obtained AR-15 automatic rifle, semi-automatic rifle, and gunned down 3 men, killing 2 of them. The cops had welcomed Kyle Rittenhouse with his AR-15. Oh, we're so glad you guys are here. It's hot out here. You want some water? And then he goes and he shoots those 3 men down. When he comes back, he's got his hands up, you know, basically like, I'm surrendering. And the cops go right by him. They don't see threat. But with Tamir Rice, who was the 12-year-old child playing in a park in Cleveland with a toy gun, they rolled up on him within 2 seconds. And Ohio is what they call an open carry state. You are allowed to openly carry a weapon as long as you're not pointing it at anybody. Well, there was nobody in the park. And so Tamir Rice is there with his toy gun. Granted, it didn't have the red tip on it to say, hey, I'm a toy, but he's not pointing it at anybody. He's not a threat. Within 2 seconds, he's gunned down because they saw black gun threat.
In your book, you also write, not only in this book, but there's another book, Eyes Off the Prize, The United Nations and African American Struggle for Human Rights, 44 and 55. And I was reminded of that because you speak of Henry Cabot Lodge, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, saying, I can clearly see the harm that Little Rock is doing. More than 2/3 of the world is non-white. And the reactions of their representatives is easy to see. What I'm trying to get at is if getting more guns to black people is not going to work. For example, Netherlands, I think it's the 4th or 5th investor in the United States. You wouldn't believe it's such a small country, but we have a lot of money to spend. What role could the global community, because you've studied this, and looking at the past gives us answers, you know, towards the future.
Yes, it does. A lot. And I don't mean to be flip in that one of the things that I am convinced that moved the civil rights movement, besides having the economic space for that to happen, was the international pressure on the domestic side. Because the U.S., this was the Cold War, and the U.S. was doing this strut like it was the Jim Crow leader of the free world. And one of those things is not like the other. It is really hard to be the Jim Crow leader of the free world. And so you saw the civil rights leadership and the activists pushing on that international image, compelling the White House, compelling the Senate to move, compelling the Supreme Court to move. That kind of international pressure is not there right now.
Maybe we have the same problem, that we deny that anti-Blackness courses through our history. Oh, whoops, did I say something?
And one of the things that we know about movement is that movement can be global, because a lot of these issues, so the issue of anti-Blackness is tied not only to slavery, but also tied to colonialism. The issue of the structural racism that those systems put in place that create these massive inequities. It's not just in the U.S. We see these inequities throughout. When we begin to work together, to think together, I really do believe that we could have the world and the democracy that we deserve.
That's beautiful. My last question is, you spoke about, in the op-ed with The Guardian, the twin pandemics, the pandemics of mass shootings and the pandemic of anti-Blackness. The last book that Martin Luther King wrote was, where do we go from here? Chaos or community?
Mm-hmm. We have the power to make that decision. And that's one of the things that we really have to be cognizant of. What oppression does, what voter suppression does, what the use of gun violence and terrorism does, is it makes you believe that you are powerless. It makes you believe that this is as good as it's going to get. Understand they are wielding that power, wielding that suppression, wielding that terror, because you are powerful. Never cede your power. When I have folks talking about, oh, it doesn't matter if I vote, because the same thing's going to be, it's always been what it's always been. That is ceding your power. That's giving it up without a fight. And that allows it to always be what it's always been. One of the things I tell young folks, right now in the U.S., the demographic of young folks, there are more of them than there are of baby boomers. If they voted at the same percentage in turnout as the baby boomers, whoo, oh man, whew. Yes, yes.
If I have speaking engagements, I always welcome the white audiences. I'd like to welcome you as a minority here, because we now, time's up. I would like to thank you. Could you give her a round of applause?
Thank you.
Carol Anderson is a professor of African American Studies at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, and the author of such books as The Second, Race and Guns in a Fatally Unequal America. And she was interviewed by the Ugandan-born Dutch presenter Andrew Makinga. Did you know that you can go to our website, john-adams.nl/videos, where there is, in fact, a link to this extraordinary event. And we also have a newsletter you can sign up for, and a treasure trove, a veritable treasure trove, we always say, of great American thinkers and speakers at john-adams.nl. And while you're there, become a member of the John Adams. You will support this program and you get a discount to future live events. In the meantime, you should go to wherever you get your podcasts and leave a review. This will help get the word out, and we can keep on sharing the very best of American thinkers with you, free of charge. That's it for this week's show. Our theme is called La Prensa by the Parlandos. Our editor is Tracy Metz. From Amsterdam, this was Bright Minds, the podcast from the John Adams Institute. I'm Jonathan Gruber. Thank you for listening.